Well, I love those words of Wendell Berry that Sally read to us in the reading this morning, and like him, there are times when I wake up in the middle of the night at the slightest sound and wonder what kind of world I'm living in and what kind of world I've brought another human being into. It was a conversation we had just in our home last night, by the way. And for him, the answer to the pain of the world, or one of them, is to go out and lie down in the place of wild things, to see day-blind stars and birds and animals, which he says, do not tax themselves with forethought of grief. I tax myself with forethought of grief all the time. I pay my debts for worries about things that some of them have never come true. For him, he finds that kind of rest. He calls it a grace in the natural world. And I find that in my life, it's a lot easier to experience that kind of grace in the presence of the natural world than it is to recognize it when it's actually happening between human beings. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, recently told me a story from her life in which a person almost missed the fact that grace was happening right before their eyes. Her dad has been saving an instrument to give to her since he was a young man, since he was a teenager, actually. He played in a band when he was in high school, and he was the bass player in that band, and he played a Hofner bass guitar, which for those of you who've been paying attention to Beatles trivia, is the kind of bass guitar that Paul McCartney played. It's actually not a great guitar, but it's what Paul McCartney played, and there are not that many of them in the world, just a few hundred. And so it makes this guitar a precious and valuable thing. Now, her father doesn't have any advanced degrees or a job that makes a lot of money, and he doesn't have a lot of valuable possessions to hand down. In fact, he's got this Hofner bass guitar. When he had his child, and then when she had hers, he knew that he wanted to give it to her and continue this gift giving. But he ran on hard times. He got sick, lost his job, and before he knew it, he was completely out of money, using his credit cards to pay his bills. And so he did what he had to do, but which broke his heart, which was to sell this guitar. So he went on to Craigslist and put the guitar up for sale, and he got a call from a friend of his, a rich friend of his, who said, "What are you doing? I'll give you twice what you're paying, what you're asking for this guitar. It's worth way more than that. And why don't you just treat me like a pawn shop? If you come on better times, if you make your money back, come to me, you can buy it back from me, but until then, I'll hold on to it for you." So very reluctantly, and in a very difficult moment that required setting aside some serious pride, her father sold this precious thing to his friend. Now, what he didn't know is that his friend had a plan. His friend knew that this was an important guitar and one of the only valuable possessions that he was planning to give to his lineage, and so his friend found a guy in England who restores Hofner bass guitars. There are not many of these guys. And he sent it to England, where he had it restored, almost to pristine condition. The knobs had been falling off, the pickups weren't so great, but when he got it back, it was good enough that Sir Paul McCartney himself would have played the guitar. And he held on to it, chasing after his friend for 2 years, trying to give it back. But his friend was never there. The man who had to sell the guitar felt an amount of shame at the new position he was in life and avoided his friends. They kept inviting him over for dinner, and he would say he was going to be there and then not show. They would throw a party and invite him, and he wouldn't show. And time after time, find a way to not engage this group of friends. Now, I don't know if you've been in that position where in a moment when you feel like you've hit bottom, the thing you need is community, but you run away from it. Well, his friend finally finds him in an event he knows he's going to be at, and when he turns around, his friend's there holding the guitar case and opens it up to show him this beautifully restored thing. My friend's father brought this over to her house and gave it to her and was telling the story and broke down crying and said the words, "I've been such a terrible friend, and this is how they paid me back. I've been such a terrible friend, and this is how they paid me back." And in her profession, she knew to say, "This is grace. What you're seeing is grace. Friends do not keep a tally sheet, an accounting measure, so that the scales will be even. It doesn't have to add up." But he almost couldn't accept the gift. Because I think he shares something that I share, and I think you might too, which is so often we make sense of the world we live in by people getting what they deserve. It makes sense. This happens, and this is the response. In a proportional world where the scales even, the world makes sense. But grace is something that we are lacking. I look at my Facebook feed, is filled with links I'm supposed to click on to tell me that the people I already don't like have done something that will make me not like them more. They are at it again. I've watched as I have taken pleasure in people falling from grace. The religious figure, the senator, who says one thing and lives another and gets caught. And I have delighted in watching them get what was coming to them, while forgiving the same indiscretion of someone of my own faith tradition or political party. Grace. We live in a culture so consumed with treating people like products that I think we've often learned to treat the imperfections and pain of the world with a disproportionate amount of outrage and anger. Something goes wrong at home or church, a school, and suddenly the end of the world is upon us because I'm supposed to get what I pay for. Grace. But in our religious tradition, in Unitarian universalism, we have a direct historical lineage that says, no, people don't get what they deserve, they get more than what they deserve, and they should. Our universalist ancestors believed in a God who loved creation so much that that God would never let any one human being go. You could not say no to the love of God. All people would be restored in the arms of the holy. And one of those people is a guy named George de Beneville. Has anybody heard of George de Beneville? That's my fault. He's really great, and you should know about him. His story is so interesting. George de Beneville was one of the first preachers of universalism in America, but we don't tell his story that much. So here's this guy born just after 1700. He's a French Huguenot. His family are aristocrats, and they live in Britain. In fact, Queen Anne is his godmother. And both of his parents die at an early age, and the people in the court decide that he's kind of a difficult person to live with, and that he should be a sailor, spending a lot of time on the high seas. So they send him out as, just an adolescent, out on these merchant ships that go around on the high seas. And on one of these moments, he's sitting, lounging in the sun and reading, and something happens. Two Spanish Muslims are walking across selling things on the deck of the boat. He's in North Africa. One of them falls down and cuts a huge gash in his leg. The men around him, his fellow Muslims, gather around him and start crying because their friend is crying. Their tears are spilling into his wound, and they're getting loud. And so, George de Beneville, being an aristocrat of the time, calls a waiter over to go ask these fellows what they think they're doing, being so loud on the deck of this ship while I'm trying to relax. They come over, the man with the bleeding wound in his leg and his friends, and they tell him, well, our friend is in pain. So therefore, we are in pain. And in fact, our tears with the salt in them are good for a wound. And by the way, we're praying to God that God will relieve the suffering of our dear friend. So he's a teenager at this time, and he has a revelation. He writes in his journal, "Here I am, a white Christian being taught by a black Muslim that I am entirely wrong. In my society, we call these people heretics or heathens. It's me who's the heretic and the heathen." He goes into a depression for 15 months until he is visited in the night by a vision of Jesus who tells him, "It's okay, relax. Not only are you okay, but everybody's okay, and everybody goes to heaven." So the 17-year-old George de Beneville goes on a preach-off across Western Europe. He decides that he has to be a lay preacher, giving news to everybody that all will be well. Now, this doesn't go over so well in some states, and he is given the death penalty on a number of occasions, narrowly escaping the executioner's axe. In fact, once he's standing up, the blindfold is being put on him, he's walking toward putting his head down, and King Louis gives him a reprieve because his godmother, Queen Anne, pulled a couple of strings. He moves to Germany, and they start holding these secret worship services for universalism out in the woods. Sometimes 400 or 500 people would gather at night in secret to preach the good news that there was no hell. Or at least if there was, you didn't go there. He goes into a fever, a severe fever, so much so that he's pronounced dead for 42 hours. Now, I don't know if any of you have gone to these old cemeteries where they have a bell on a string down in the coffin so that if you were, by chance, not dead, you could pull the string and alert those around you that I'm here. Well, this is one of those moments. George de Beneville is pronounced dead and put on the physician's table. He's examined and placed into a coffin. The coffin is getting ready to go into the earth. And during this 42-hour period, he has what must be some Dante Alighieri-style fever dream in which he's taken by two angels dressed in white down to the depths of hell. 7 levels, he says in his journal, where they tell him, look, see what suffering looks like and feel it for yourself. They take him up through these 7 levels, and finally he goes to heaven, where in his journal he records the fact that he meets Adam and Eve and Jesus and a whole host of other people who then tell him, don't worry, we have fantastic news. Nobody goes to hell. In fact, everybody is restored to the arms of a loving God for all eternity. Please go tell the world. So he wakes up in a coffin, opens it. This part's true. This is a true story. He opens the coffin, stands up, his brother's there, they freak out, and he says, I have a mission. He goes around preaching universalism and then moves to Pennsylvania, where he has basically the first Universalist church in America in the early 1700s. Now, his universalism, his experience of seeing these two men in pain, leads him to the affirmation that not only is the universe founded on an economy of generosity and grace so expansive that no one can escape it, not even his enemies, but that he is called to lead by example. So his universalism is radical at the time. He starts preaching for radical gender equality, women's suffrage, radical racial equality, the abolition of slavery. He trades medicines. He has an apothecary in his house with the Native Americans near his home. He holds these kind of universalist tent revival style services in his house. There's a creek that runs under it, and they have baptisms there. And then the Revolutionary War comes. The Battle of Germantown is just down the road from his land, and British soldiers are killed. Now, he's a sympathizer with the colonists. However, when a British general comes to his house and says, look, no one will give us land to bury our dead. Now, this is the trial of the Boston Marathon bomber this week, and you'll remember that they had the same problem. But George de Beneville says to them, good news. When I was pronounced dead for 42 hours in a coffin and 2 angels descended with me into hell before I went up to heaven to meet Jesus and all the saints, they told me that there's no such thing as an enemy. So you can bury him next to me. And so if you go to George de Beneville's house today, his homestead in Pennsylvania, you will see his grave and his wife's and the body of 2 enemy British soldiers next to him. This is a universalism that says the love of God is so expansive that no imperfection will erase it, that you are not in control of the universe. Get over the idea that who you love matters if you're mattering for a small group of people. Love as many human beings as you can. You should fight for radical equality, even to the point where you are being buried next to terrorists. It's radical. And it was at the time. Universalists were not allowed to be on jury panels in some parts of the United States. Because, and people rightly said, they don't believe in a fair world. The scales don't add up. And they were right. They didn't believe in a fair world. They believed in a world that was more than fair. Radical even. That's why the 14 cows story is so powerful to me. Because here's this response to human pain halfway across the globe, giving the thing that is most important to them, the thing that gives them life, and it will not add up. That's why it's magical. The scales don't even. 14 cows or 40 are not going to bring back 3,000 human lives, or the suffering that came from them, or the wars that came after. The people who lost friends and loved ones in those buildings may not even know that somewhere on the other side of the planet, 50 cows with the twin towers marked on their ears are being lovingly cared for by an elder of the Messiah. But that's why it's magical. It doesn't add up. And if we are going to continue calling ourselves a part of the Unitarian Universalist tradition, then the universalism that we rest in will have to be radical too. Not radical to your sister-in-law, radical to you, to me, to us. It will make us wake up in the middle of the night and ask if we have forgiven all. It will make us shudder at the first sound and ask if the world that we're bringing our children and family into is a one that will be just and loving beyond all measure. It's one that asks us whether or not we can give up trying to be in control of the universe, to work for justice and give up the pain that comes from waiting for somebody to get what's coming to them, to give up trying to even the scales, and to model a holy divine love that will not let a single human being go, to the point where we are barred from jury panels, advocating for justice in the street, buried next to terrorists, forgiving what has been done wrong to us, and building a world that is excessively just and loving. There is something magic alive in the world. Grace is real, and we're called to be its evidence. We are called to tell stories that say, yes, sometimes a bad friend on hard times ends up being relentlessly pursued with generosity. And sometimes a human being who is bigoted ends up knowing that in humility all are one. Sometimes a human being who comes close to their own death wakes up to realize that God's love is so pervasive that everyone, even enemies, count. And sometimes 3,000 people die, and halfway across the world, people give what is most important to them in a magical way that will never, ever add up. There is magic alive in the world. There is grace that is possible even in our imperfections, and we can help make it more and more real. This is the invitation of our heritage. May it be so. Amen.